Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry that it took me so long to send this to you. Um, yeah, life got in the way. That sometimes happens, and lousy excuse. It certainly doesn't excuse, but yeah, wanted to take a little time, tell you a little bit about unions and teacher compensation, mostly because I don't think it gets covered as well or as deeply as I think it ought. And this might just be the start of a conversation, but at least it's a start. So, yeah, without further ado, let's talk about it a little bit. So, really quickly, before we get started, I wanted to give you a little bit of a bracketing disclaimer on I I feel pretty strongly about this, and one of the reasons for that is what happened to me in Wisconsin. So, um, during the school year of 2010, 2011, I made more than I did my last year of teaching at a public high school. So, at 2010, 2011, yeah, something happened politically in the state that had pretty significant impact on my paycheck, and not only my paycheck, but a lot of other things that I'll explain in a minute. Um, I lost about $3,500 during the school year 2011 to 2012. I would have caught up the year that I left if I had stayed in Cedar Grove, but that was basically a 5-year kickback in the compensation that we earned as educators. The drop in base pay, and that was just base pay. The drop in base pay meant that I also lost money for directing the play and coaching forensics. Um, Doing the play, I think, was about, I forget what it was, maybe 5% of my base pay was the pay that I ended up receiving for coaching, for directing the play, and then maybe 3% for forensics. A lot of schools do it that way. That if you are going to direct a play, if you're going to coach cross country, if you're going to coach football, assistant coach football, that they are going to, if you are working in the district, they're going to pay you a percentage on top of your normal paycheck. So instead of earning 100% of your paycheck, you're going to earn 107.5% of your paycheck if you're a basketball coach, something like that. So that's just the way that they work that out. So if you get a raise, that also means that you get a raise for coaching. Um, so this is how a typical compensation bracket works. So this is how it worked for us in my last school district, 2011, 2012. You'll notice that right on the bottom over here, I'm thinking hoping you can see my cursor. This is a master's degree plus 24 grad credits is what that means. And if you've been working in the district for 14 years and you're a master's plus 24 credits, you'd be making $64,763 in the year 2011, 2012. I was at that particular time right around here, Masters plus 24 and or Masters plus 12, something like that, and about 10 years of experience, and I was right around 56, I think. Um, so anyway, that's kind of the way things were. That has changed a little bit. Sorry, as I adjust this screen, doesn't look like I'm going to get any more of that. Um, this is what it became. So in 2015, when I was already teaching at Northwestern, the compensation package changed. The school district ended up getting less money from the state. I'll explain why in a minute. But instead of paying us according to a table, the school district paid us according to this chart. Okay, so if you were starting at the school district, you ended up making $39,000 to $45,000. Okay. If you were progressing, you made this amount: proficient, professional, advanced, or exemplary. And you could only get exemplary if you had a master's degree. Now, the difference between this and this, money wise, isn't particular noticeable. There's a max of 70,000 here and a max of 64,000 here, and it's a difference of 4 years, which is about this, reasonable. The one thing that you knew about this is you could kind of plan ahead. If I knew I was going to get to bachelor's 30 and I was moving from my sixth year to my seventh year, I knew I was going to get a pay raise of about 1,700 bucks, $100 a month, 1,500 bucks a month, give or take. Um, that or 150 bucks a month, sorry. That makes a difference, right? Here, you didn't have that. There's no if I have one more year of experience, I'm going to increase my pay. And the assumption is that the longer you teach, the better a teacher you're going to be. And that assumption is not always accurate. I think we all know of teachers who were probably in the business longer than they should have been. And that's one of the reasons that they went to this model. Of course, what this doesn't provide is how any information on how one could potentially reach from proficient to professional, or what it looks like to be an advanced teacher versus an exemplary teacher. And what we found out was this was up to the principal. So the principal made decisions solely based on what they wanted to base those decisions on. There was no rubric. Um, so it pretty much came down to the principal's word. And there was a little bit of concern there that if the principal has favorite teachers or something like that, they might end up getting exemplary at the expense of somebody else. We also found out that the administration was only giving principals. We had three principals, one in the high school, one in the middle school, and one in the elementary school. The principals had a certain dollar figure that they had to work within for their compensation. So if they offered two exemplaries, that meant that instead of having multiple proficients over here, they might have to bump somebody down to progressing to pay for the exemplary. So basically, it just pit one teacher against another. And that wasn't a particularly healthy thing. So, the reason for this was something called Act 10. It was enacted in the spring of 2011. There's actually a very similar piece of legislation that moved through Iowa a couple of years ago. Um, it stripped unions of collective bargaining rights. It was called a right to work. There are positives and negatives to each of those. But the problem with this for teachers is Wisconsin had very, very little money. We were dirt poor. We were running a deficit budget. And there are two different options to fixing a budget in a state. The two biggest components are Medicare and Medicaid, healthcare for old and little people, and teacher compensation. Those are the two biggest budget line items. And unless you are trying to commit political suicide, you're not going to take healthcare away from the old people or from the teeny tiny babies, and rightly so. So your only other option is to take money away from the teachers. And that's what happened. And it was kind of a painful process, to be honest. Um, Unions were made optional. In order for a union to maintain a hold in a school, they needed 90% agreement from the local teacher associations, give or take. Um, it cut state funding for schools, and as you know, I hope you know that 50% of a school's funding comes from the state budget, and the other 50%, give or take a few, comes from local property taxes. So most schools lost about 10% of their budget in the first year. We were running a budget, our school district, small school district. MOC is maybe a little bit bigger than us, but our budget was $10 million a year, and we lost $1 million that first year. That's a lot of money. The second wave of cuts 2 years later saw a further 5 to 10% of funding. We ended up losing about 7% that next year. So the dropping pay ensured a smaller base for unions to operate. So as teachers, we ended up making less money. If we're making less money, it's harder to pay union dues, which is exactly what the government wanted. So it broke the unions. Um, the cuts went deeper than just state contributions to public schools. It disallowed schools to raise funds through property taxes unless everything went to a community referendum. And community referendums are great for when you're trying to build a new school. People see the value in a new school building. It's cool, it's sexy, it's exciting. Um, they don't see the value in raising property taxes just to make ends meet for the teachers, for teacher pay. So all school projects go to referendum, big projects, but yeah. Um, so Act 10 in my school, they started by cutting health insurance to try to balance the budget. Saving $1 million in a year is difficult. So they started with our health insurance. Admittedly, we had unnecessarily awesome insurance. There was no copay and a small deductible. So I literally paid pretty much nothing for me and my family for insurance. The reason for that is unions, instead of asking for an increase in pay, had asked for an increase in benefits. Um, so our health insurance was the Cadillac of health insurance. It was kind of ridiculous how great it was. Um, so, but because we didn't have collective bargaining as a union, we weren't allowed to go in and chat with the school board about how we thought the school ought to save money. Um, I'll talk about that more in a couple minutes. So the school was still in trouble after cutting the health insurance. So we had a meeting, and we knew it was going to be a bad meeting because the superintendent and the principals were in the front, and all of the teachers filed up into this big lecture hall. And basically, they said, "We have no money, and you've got option A and option B. Option A is we're going to cut one teacher position from every building to try to save the money. Or option B is everybody can take a pay cut to try to save the money that we don't have." It was a district of about 1,000 pupils, 300, 350 in each of those buildings. But thankfully, even though it was a bad news meeting, at least we had a meeting. Our administration still valued our opinion. So even though we didn't necessarily like our options, we were given a choice. And I have a lot of respect for our administration for giving us that choice because they didn't have to do that. So the other thing that Act 10 did is it killed respect for teachers in the district and the state, and that really kind of hurt. There was political fighting, and because of that, parents who were typically a little bit more right-leaning, parents picked sides against the teachers who were typically a little bit more left-leaning. Um, Many parents ended up blaming schools and teachers for state's funding. Um, Teachers were hassled. Um, you walk into a restaurant or Walmart and you're wearing a teacher shirt, and I was hassled, which was kind of uncomfortable. Students actually wore shirts bashing teachers, um, wore those shirts to school. And as a teacher, you can't necessarily kick a kid out for wearing a t-shirt that says, if you can do, if you can't teach. Um, Even though it's disrespectful, it's kicking a kid out for that means a parent phone call, and then the parent gets all upset because free speech and all that kind of stuff. So it was just kind of uncomfortable. And there was also infighting between teachers for the highest pay brackets, and then infighting between districts for the best teachers. So if your school was particularly wealthy and was in a community that had a lot of money, it made it really, really simple to offer more money to the teachers who are leaving other districts. Because we all know that there are some areas in Sioux City that have a lot of money, and other areas in Sioux City that don't have a whole lot of money. And that's the same regardless of where you go. So a couple of things that I think you ought to know about unions. Um, Number one, as far as positives, they allow teachers to present a unified front for bargaining and compensation. I'll talk more about that in a minute. They allow teachers to present ideas to the board about their positions. I'm going to pause it here because I've got a 15-minute limit, and we're coming up on 15 minutes, and hopefully I can get through the rest of it in the next 15-minute section. More in a minute.